Hello and welcome to the Movie Paradise. I'm your host Nathanael Molnár and this is Movie Night Tonight. Every single week here we watch a new film and we discuss it in depth with each month having a new theme. We are currently in the month of April, which is our month of Edgar Wright movies, and the movie we are talking about tonight is 2007's Hot Fuzz. I'm your host Nathanael Molnár. I'm joined by a great panel today. With me is Matt Smith.
Hello.
And we have someone else with us today, Connor
What?
Murphy.
Hey.
So,
Where's everyone been?
they've been busy.
Stop
It's
being busy.
time.
There's nothing more important than the movie Paradise.
You
If
know,
anyone tries to tell you otherwise, they're wrong, and you should take them out of your life.
so before we get into this spoiler discussion, and it is a spoiler discussion, we are talking about this film as if you watched it with us last night. Let's go around and say what our first impressions of the film are and roughly how many times we've seen it, starting with Matt.
I'm trying to think of the number. It's arbitrary at this point. 3 or more times for every
Only 3
movie.
or more?
I don't know. It's Edgar Wright movies. I've seen them
Yeah.
all a ton of times. I don't
If I
know.
had guessed for you, I would have said like 8.
Nah.
No?
Shaun of the Dead, maybe. Hot Fuzz there. I mean, I love Hot Fuzz, but I'm a part of the Shaun of the Dead is better. The correct group of people.
No.
And
I'll save it for the discussion, but I'm with you on that one.
Oh,
no, but I mean, I still like it. It has a lot of the same things that Shaun of the Dead, just Edgar Wright's style and his approach to comedy, his approach to using the whole entire frame and using just everything about his style is still this and still in here, and it's in all his movies.
Yeah.
So I still really like it. I think it's really fun. It seems a little bit more structured than Shaun of the Dead, maybe. Sure, it's more structured, more. It feels like it feels more normal
yeah.
in a way. In the way it's written, it feels. I don't know.
Feels less like a Monty Python movie.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
I really felt like Shaun of the Dead felt like a Monty Python movie, and I wish that I had been here to talk about it last week. I was very busy, but
Yeah.
I would have loved to be here for every single one of these movies this month.
So, before we move on to your first impressions, Connor, I want to preface this discussion, and I think I gave this preface last time, but just so we're all on the same page, since this is we're doing something different with the theme for this month. Previous themes for previous months, we've done genres of films or types of films. This is a month of directors, and so not only are we talking about the films individually, but we're also talking about and analyzing and discussing the style of the director and how it relates to each of their films that we watch and how it progresses changes and evolves as we go further. So all that to say, you can talk about your thoughts on Shaun of the Dead and you can openly compare, because that is part of the point, is having seen Shaun of the Dead. And now we are at Hot Fuzz with Edgar Wright's next film that he made. He did not he made some shorts, but he didn't make another feature film in between Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz. So
Yeah.
comparing the two and talking about the two together is definitely very important when we're looking at a director's filmography.
Yeah, I think we talked about every film Edgar Wright's ever made last week. It's more of
We
like
just spent like 20 minutes talking about Baby Driver.
expect that to happen many times. It's kind of like 60% is the movie we watched last night. The other 40 is just split between every other thing. So
Yeah.
so yeah, watch all the movies before you watch this, just in case.
Yeah. So anyway,
We'll try not to.
All that to say, you can talk about Shaun of the Dead.
Beautiful.
Don't feel like you don't have to, or that you can't talk about it.
I
This is
love
Hot
Scott
Fuzz.
Pilgrim versus the World,
And I love Baby Driver.
And let's talk about that for an hour.
We will next week. Oh, I can't say that. That's a spoiler for the end of the show.
Oh no!
But anyways, Connor,
This is a
roughly,
spoiler discussion for this current show that you're listening to.
Yes. Connor, first impressions of Hot Fuzz and roughly how many times you've seen it. And if you wanted to just say a couple of quick things about Shaun of the Dead, you're welcome to.
I really like Hot Fuzz. It's probably, it is my favorite Edgar Wright movie, definitely. And I am in the camp of, I think it's better than Shaun of the Dead. I just feel like it shows the lessons that Edgar Wright learned from Shaun of the Dead to make Hot Fuzz. And that's really my biggest argument. He delivers a lot cleaner, more obvious puns, and he also has more ability to get his nuances to create a stronger story. It feels like Shaun of the Dead is much more of a slapstick comedy, and I feel like the story is much more engaging for Hot Fuzz. It really wraps you up in the drama of it as well. I've probably seen... I'm also going to say how many times I've seen Shaun of the Dead, because that's important. I've seen Shaun of the Dead probably 3, maybe 4 times. Hot Fuzz I've seen definitely 5 or more times, probably 6, if I had to guess. I really like both of these movies a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that Shaun of the Dead feels like a Monty Python movie, which is definitely not a bad thing. I really like a lot of Monty Python stuff. But I feel like, just like in the... There's a word for like an all-encompassing piece of art that like gets everything across that you want to get in art, and I feel like Hot Fuzz is more approaching that than Shaun of the Dead is. It's a comedy, but it's also a drama, and it has action, and it really wraps you in all of those elements, and I feel like it does all of that very well. It's realizes exactly what it wants to do. It becomes exactly what you want it to be. So
yeah. So I have seen Hot Fuzz. I think this was my second time watching Hot Fuzz. And I would say I am in the camp of I prefer Shaun of the Dead. I like this movie, but whereas I loved Shaun of the Dead, this one I like. I think it's good. But I thought a lot of the things that Edgar Wright did with Shaun of the Dead, he didn't do. I think we're on opposite ends. I didn't feel like he did them as well in Hot Fuzz. I don't think this is as witty as Shaun of the Dead. I don't think it's as clever as Shaun of the Dead. I feel like Shaun of the Dead is really packed to the brim of, and we were talking about this last week, like all these different callbacks, and I'm not saying that Hot Fuzz doesn't have its callbacks or it doesn't have, because you can watch Shaun of the Dead and you watch like the first act of that, and they pretty much reference and set up everything that happens in the movie. And it's so layered in that every time you watch it, you're constantly like, oh, I didn't see that, or oh, that's a reference to that, or so that has that going for it in Shaun of the Dead. And Hot Fuzz does have that to a degree. It doesn't feel like, I don't know.
The best callback in Hot Fuzz is when it calls back to Shaun of the Dead.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah.
No, I agree with what you're saying. When I watch, we have someone who likes Hot Fuzz better, so I'm just going to go on the negative because why not? I don't think Hot Fuzz is as funny. I don't think it's as witty. It feels like it feels like time was taken away from the wit and the callbacks to push more story. Which is the biggest difference between the two movies, and I'm not saying that's a positive or negative thing. I think what movie you like more is just which one of those things do you prefer. Yeah. And the fact that we have 2 very good movies made by Edgar Wright, that you can pick which one you prefer, and it's really like you don't have to say anything negative about one to say you like the other.
You're right.
Yeah.
So I like this sort of shift in what's being focused on.
Makes it a different movie. Yeah. It's not just the same movie again with a different
plot. Nor does do we have to only compare them to each other.
Well, we certainly can't compare them to World's End.
There's only 2 movies in the trilogy.
You're right.
So.
Meaning Hot Fuzz can stand alone on its own, and its merits doesn't have to be based upon, well, is it as good as Shaun of the Dead, or does it do as good of a job with these things? But as we are talking about Edgar Wright as a director, the comparison is invited. I think the biggest difference of why we have more of this kind of natural comedy in Shaun of the Dead and more story emphasis with Hot Fuzz, I think is just the nature of the films. You keep referring to Shaun of the Dead as like a Monty Python-esque film. When we were talking about it last week, we were saying it's a spoof film, essentially. It's an action comedy zombie spoof film, and with that spoof nature comes a lot more comedy just baked even into the narrative.
Right.
The narrative points of the film and the way that the story is structured is comedic in of itself, because it's parodying what we have seen before with other zombie movies. We don't necessarily have that spoof element with Hot Fuzz. It's more of its own standalone story. And so as it stands on its own, it doesn't naturally have that underlying layer of comedy in of itself. Yeah. And so while there is great comedy in Hot Fuzz, you don't have that lively energy that Shaun of the Dead had. Shaun of the Dead kind of, the second it starts, it just goes until it's done. And part of that is the comedy, and part of that is the execution, and part of that is the editing and the action and all that. There's a lot of downtime. You have a lot of slower parts. You have parts that are more emotional and more dramatic. And with that, the pace isn't as strong. It isn't as consistent. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But I guess when we're looking at the two films, the one I gravitate more towards is the energetic, fun one that starts going and never stops, compared to the one that has some great comedy but also has slower parts and more dramatic parts. Yeah,
I can definitely see where you're coming from, that it's more of a relentless comedy. It's more like uproarious and funny. I definitely can agree with that. I think the reason that I prefer Hot Fuzz is just sort of the type of movie that I prefer. It's really like a personal choice thing here. It's not like one is objectively better. They're different movies, and it depends what you go into it looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
Hot Fuzz has a spoof nature to it.
Yeah,
but it's very on the nose, and we're referencing other cop movies.
Yeah,
and we're going to blatantly reference them.
We're going to include them in the movie
multiple times, and it is a fundamental part of Nick Frost's character.
Yeah.
So it definitely has the spoof thing, but it's just not like. But there's no like reference to zombie movies in Shaun of the Dead.
Right. Yeah. And it's also much
other than the title.
Other than the title, of course.
It's much more of a pure spoof movie as well. Like Hot Fuzz has a lot of departs from the type of movie that it's spoofing.
Yeah, Hot Fuzz has spoof elements, whereas Shaun of the Dead is a through and through spoof movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they do what movie is the shooting in the air from?
Point Break?
Yeah.
Point Break, and they have there's that one shot from Bad Boys 2 that's replicated between the two characters, and like those are the two movies that he pulled out. It was like, which one do you want to watch? Yeah. So like, I don't know, I appreciate it. I think it kind of makes it fit a little bit more into the trilogy in itself, but it's just what kind of do you like it when those things are directly referenced, or do you prefer it when it's not necessary references?
Yeah,
even in Shaun of the Dead, they told you not to use the Z word, being very specific to use Z.
Yeah.
What was it? The
mobily deceased.
The mobily deceased.
I forgot about that. I need to watch that movie again so I can talk to you guys about it. I just want to have a quick moment of silence for the third movie in the Cornetto trilogy.
It's not bad.
Okay.
And we're not watching it.
We were originally going to talk about it this month because I had thought that we were going to be able to do 5 shows in the month of April. And so I was thinking the Cornetto trilogy and then Scott Pilgrim and Baby Driver.
Just steal one
and
from
then
me.
Once we had 4, it's like, well, of these 5, which one do you cut?
Yeah, it's the obvious choice, but
it is bad. Actually.
Just to
nothing is being said by its omission.
Yeah. Just to talk about it, I mean, I love it. I remember
I haven't seen it, so don't
we'll
talk too
watch
much
it eventually. I think I told you that in an interview, Simon Pegg said that his character is his favorite character that he's played.
That's interesting because wording's a little bit different, but he had said that this was his favorite movie. Hot Fuzz was his favorite movie that he's acted in. So it's interesting. Hot Fuzz is his favorite movie he's acted in, but World's End is his favorite character.
Yeah, and his character is very, very different.
Yeah, the total actually kind of opposite of both of
his
characters.
Yeah, they kind of switch what you would expect Simon Pegg and Nick Frost to play.
You're right. Yeah.
So it totally makes sense that he would like see it as unique or different.
I do really like those characters in that movie though. Yeah. I just feel like it's an unsuccessful space for them to play in, but they play pretty well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think they're a great duo, like the entire trilogy. They're fantastic.
Yeah.
And it definitely has its weak points, but I like it. So I just enjoy making fun of it because
Yeah.
it's like the ugly stepchild or whatever. It's like it's not the other two.
Yeah.
But it's the prequels of the Cornetto trilogy.
It's just like
It's the fourth Indiana Jones movie of the Cornetto trilogy.
it's just like what could it have been,
I don't know.
If it were on par, imagine having another Edgar Wright movie in that trilogy that was like at the level, because it doesn't feel like it's in the trilogy.
Dude,
really.
he wasn't gonna beat Scott Pilgrim, so I mean,
Yeah.
just saying.
Scott Pilgrim feels like the spiritual third movie in the Cornetto trilogy.
Bringing it back to Hot Fuzz.
No, we're gonna talk about Scott Pilgrim now. So anyway,
We have a whole show. I said
Daniel-
we could do upwards of 2 hours
the
for
thing,
you
I have
for
been
Scott Pilgrim.
just let it happen.
No, Hot Fuzz. We're talking about Hot Fuzz.
Okay, Hot
And
Fuzz, fine.
So one of the things when we were doing Shaun of the Dead last week that we were talking about a lot was the editing style of Shaun of the Dead. And so opening it up, looking at Shaun of the Dead and how that film is edited, the montage scenes of it just punching in on something and moving along, punching in and moving along, a lot of sound edits to have things line up with each other, to have editing so that something is the setup and something else is the payoff. When we look at the editing of Shaun of the Dead and now we see Hot Fuzz, what's the comparison? What do we see in Hot Fuzz? Maybe this is along the lines of what you're talking about and how Edgar Wright learned from his mistakes, or maybe that would be a different part of the film.
Sorry, but I was just gonna say it's similar. I mean, it's Edgar Wright's style. That's how his movies are made. I think they're more sort of concentrated into their individual bits, as opposed to where Shaun of the Dead is just kind of like, just look everywhere. Mm-hmm. What are you looking at? But like, I think there's more of attention to individual parts. Like I think when he's on the train, like basically between the two taxi shots, the shots of the taxi. That's right. Taxi trip. Whatever. I'm really struggling here. Between the two taxi, signs or whatever. That whole like span where he's on the train and he's holding the plant. Mm-hmm. I think that's real. I think that's like one of my favorite just like segments. It's like one of the most like creative point A to point B series montages that I've seen. It's like one of my favorites. And like in terms of like sound design, I feel like this is much more, I think it's more cartoony, more over the top than Shaun of the Dead.
When you pointed it out in Shaun of the Dead, when we were doing our show, how they had like more cartoonish sound effects and stuff, I didn't notice it when we were watching that movie until you pointed it out later. This one I noticed. I noticed it a lot.
There's one of my favorites is when they're attacking the supermarket. They get those guys behind like the meat counter, and every time they hit the thing, there's just like this really nice like plastic like bong sound when they hit it. And I don't know how many times it took me to hear that sound amongst everything else that's going on, but I just really like that sound. And there's so many like just like whooshes and whips and just general over the top action noises in this movie.
Like that yeah from the beginning of whatever that song is.
Yeah.
The scene transition.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it's Edgar Wright. I mean,
it's interesting. Each of these movies has a different focus. Each of the three movies in the trilogy. It's like Shaun of the Dead feels like it's a place for them to tell jokes about a zombie apocalypse, and then Hot Fuzz feels like it's a place for them to be, these two characters interacting in a story. And then World's End feels like a bunch of characters being thrown into a situation and just reacting in character. Mm-hmm. And it's very different like places that the comedy comes from.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
He can do whatever he wants.
You're right.
One of the things that I think that Shaun of the Dead does better than Hot Fuzz, going off of this idea of the editing, was I feel like there is a lot more of the editing being part of the punchline in Shaun of the Dead as opposed to in Hot Fuzz. It does happen in Hot Fuzz, but I don't feel like it's as well thought out or as clever as it is in Shaun of the Dead. And it's used a lot more in Shaun of the Dead.
It feels more traditional. And if you can take all of Edgar Wright's movies and just like sort of put them on a spectrum, and I would say you probably have Shaun of the Dead at one end and then you have Baby Driver at the other. And like you can just like, what are they focusing more on? How close to it is it traditional, or how crazy are they going with be incredibly stylistic. So
I do still think it's still very non-traditional. It's less noticeable, definitely, but I still feel like, and I know you said it's on a spectrum, but Hot Fuzz is still very non-traditional. Like the way that they'll shoot action scenes, for example, with cutting from 5 different angles of the same person whipping out guns. You know?
Mm-hmm.
The Edgar Wright spectrum, not the editing spectrum.
Right, of course.
He's in his own little part of a much bigger,
But I think the thing that you're pointing out about Hot Fuzz is kind of the editing draws less attention to itself, which I think is also, it's sort of making room for the story to play out and for the drama, which I think it's something that the movie necessitated. If the editing called too much attention to itself, it would take away from that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I guess therein lies my biggest. It's hard to say biggest issue because it's not as much an issue as it is a preference. The big focus of this film, as you've talked about, is its story. It rather than something like Shaun of the Dead, it really puts its emphasis on its story, on its narrative, and pushing that forward. And I just don't get into the story a ton. I mean, I like it, but like I was never on the edge of my seat wondering, even though I kind of knew watching it this time how it went along, but the first time I was never on the edge of my seat like, who's the killer? Who's it going to be? Who is it? I have no idea. Like I was never truly super invested in the story. And so I guess when the focus of it is so much the story and I'm not immediately invested in it, it detracts from the film a little bit. And again, that's not an issue of the movie as much as it is a preference because I just wasn't getting into that specific story.
You actually can't be surprised who the murderer is because anything you guess would be correct.
that's true. Yeah.
So, is it the completely obvious one? Yes.
You're right.
But
I remember it's so hard to tell because I've been so abstracted from my first watch at this point. But I remember the first time I watched it really being confused. I had theories about who the killer was and all of that. And so I was surprised by that. And I felt like on the edge of my seat. I was when they trick you into thinking that Danny died in the end. I really believed it the first time.
Shout out to Nick Frost not being able to die.
Yeah.
Well, he does, but he comes. But
Connor, you've mentioned that there's a lot of things about this movie that you feel like was Edgar Wright learning from the mistakes of Shaun of the Dead.
I wouldn't say mistakes. I would say just felt like someone who had learned more about filmmaking.
So, well, I'm curious, what specifically about Hot Fuzz are you saying that about?
I think in Hot Fuzz, you really see like the characters that are central to the story being very focused on and having a very concrete arc. You see sort of real like dips and peaks of the action between characters. You see like a lull when it seems like, and I guess that is in a sense more traditional, but you see there's a downfall. He thinks that he's lost it. He comes back. It feels less like we're going to put down a very basic story of they're going to go from here to here and then tell jokes within it, which is, I think, that's really the main thing. But I also think you see the characters feeling more fleshed out. You see the characters always acting within like their boundaries and developing in ways that make sense. And it doesn't feel... I think looking back at Shaun of the Dead, it seems like a movie where the characters are very basic, just shells for jokes to be in, And I think there's considerable character depth while still having very interesting characters.
Yeah, I'd say I don't disagree with you about the characters are definitely simpler characters in Shaun of the Dead. But I think for that film, it works. And it works better. And I'd say even while these characters are a little more complex, I have to say I probably prefer the Shaun of the Dead characters. I think even though there's a simplicity to them, you get them. And you understand they, like, immediately who Shaun is. From the very beginning, like, his whole setup as a character, you understand who he is, and you understand who. Oh, I'm forgetting Nick Frost's character's name from that movie. Ed, right? You know who Ed is. You don't. They're simple characters. I don't want to say one note because they're not necessarily one note, but they don't have a ton of depth to them. They don't have a ton of intricacies to them. But you know who they are. And once we get into this movie, I mean, I like the characters. Like, I like Nick Angel, and I like Danny. But I'd say I just would prefer their characters more in Shaun of the Dead. I do really like the dynamic between Danny and Angel in this movie. I think it's because it was interesting because in Shaun of the Dead, the characters are already friends. In this, they don't know each other, and it's so you have that kind of beginning part of their relationship where they're trying to figure out what is their dynamic. And then especially once we get into the film and by the end of it, they really solidify what their back and forth is, what their dynamic is, and I really like it a lot.
Yeah,
it's a fun dynamic between them.
It really just feels like you watch so much growth in Hot Fuzz, which is, I think, the thing that feels like a more mature filmmaker to me. I think Shaun of the Dead feels like something that is like on par with when you're making your first few films and you make some slapstick comedies. It feels like, and not to say that it's, bad or childish in that regard, but the films that I made when I was in high school feel like they had the same sort of avoided the more complex story and character development and things like that to focus on things that I knew I could do well. And I don't think that Edgar Wright necessarily avoided taking on a problem that was more complex. I think he made the movie he wanted to make, but I think the way that Hot Fuzz is structured, it's a little bit harder of a story to tell, and so it feels a little bit more masterful in the fact that he accomplishes it so well. I think Shaun of the Dead, while it is great and was probably made by the best director to do it, I think could have also been made decently successfully by other directors, where Hot Fuzz feels like something that Edgar Wright had to do.
See, I think I would go to complete opposite with you. I think when I look at Shaun of the Dead, while someone could probably take the script that they wrote and do it, it would not be in the way that Edgar Wright did it.
Oh, no, definitely
You would not have the editing that Edgar Wright has with that movie. You would not have the tone. Like, I feel like there's a lot of Shaun of the Dead that is very uniquely Edgar Wright. And that if another director did it, it would probably still be a good movie, but it wouldn't have that special quality that Shaun of the Dead has. I feel like you have less of that with Hot Fuzz. I feel like you could have really any director come in and tell that story about a cop who's moving to a suburban town and a village, and all this stuff starts happening. And certainly there are qualities of the film that are unique to Edgar Wright that you wouldn't get with another director. But I feel like that basic story that is there in Hot Fuzz could basically be told by any director efficiently and well. But a lot of what makes Shaun of the Dead rise above being just kind of like a stupid spoof movie is Edgar Wright.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm saying. I think that the log lines for the two movies, the log line for Shaun of the Dead feels less specific to Edgar Wright than Hot Fuzz does. Because I think that if you say, like, zombie apocalypse spoof movie, there are a lot of directors that have made those and will make those. I feel like when you say a cop goes out to the country and it turns out that everybody is killing people to make everything good so that they can win the Village of the Year or whatever, that feels like something... Well, that doesn't sound like a comedy. That sounds like a horrible crime story, And that's what makes it such an interesting challenge. That's what I think when I hear that. It's like, oh, that's a movie that Edgar Wright directed, a comedy about this.
Yeah,
it seems like something that other directors wouldn't do.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I can definitely see that. When I look at the two, I think Shaun of the Dead is more specific to how I understand Edgar Wright's sensibilities as a director to be. Whereas Hot Fuzz, we kind of had this conversation last week in that Edgar Wright is one of those directors where if you watch one of their movies, not knowing they directed it, you would guess that they directed it. If you were to sit me down, and I was aware of Edgar Wright as a director and what he brings to his films and his style and everything, and I were to watch Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, not knowing they were directed by Edgar Wright, I think I'd probably be able to point out Shaun of the Dead and say, this is clearly Edgar Wright. Hot Fuzz, there are definitely parts of it, like the montage Matt was talking about, getting from point A to... There's definitely elements of this that I would watch and go, that feels very Edgar Wright. That's definitely Edgar Wright. But then there's a lot of it that I feel like is not very specifically Edgar Wright. That's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but I feel like Shaun, in this specific conversation we're having, Shaun of the Dead has a more personal imprint from Edgar Wright, whereas this, while there is a bit of an imprint, I feel like a lot of the basic story could have just been told by another director just as efficiently.
If we go outside of just these two movies, Hot Fuzz is definitely lacking in the sense of, is it Edgar Wright? Because if you want to compare Shaun of the Dead and Scott Pilgrim especially, those are both very much filled to the brim with, style. And then if we take Baby Driver, it's also just like filled, but instead of visual, it's definitely the more audio guided. There's a lot in that does go less noticed. So it does have the same, like, not as flashy, but in terms of just how much Edgar Wright is in it, I think is where that's kind of why those three movies are like my three favorite Edgar Wright movies, and why Hot Fuzz is just below them, because it's just how much of it do you like. And if Edgar Wright isn't your favorite director, I can definitely see, I mean, I know he's mine, so that's why I like the most of him I see in a movie, more like I'm going to like it. But if you're just going at it just like any other director and you're ranking their movies, I can definitely see why Hot Fuzz would be more.
Yeah, that's a good point.
What you're seeing isn't necessarily your favorite part or the reason you like the movie. But Hot Fuzz is more of, if back in the day you could have told me it was someone who was inspired by Edgar Wright, I would believe you. Because they're taking elements of it, but they're putting in more traditional story structure and
I guess this is just kind of showing Edgar Wright not just growing as a filmmaker, but also trying to find his footing. And I think especially when we look at something like Baby Driver, which is like, if you look at Baby Driver and you look at Shaun of the Dead, radically different films from start of someone's career. Or actually, no, he made a movie or two before Shaun of the Dead, but those were much smaller films.
No one talks about those.
Yeah. So if you look at Shaun of the Dead to Baby Driver, massive jump in filmmaking style and difference in growth and maturity and everything like that. And so I kind of look at Hot Fuzz as sort of, with Shaun of the Dead, he went full comedy, didn't really take much of it seriously. There are some parts that are more serious, like spoilers for Shaun of the Dead when he has to shoot his mom. There are some dramatic moments in that film, but it's mostly light, fun, entertaining comedy. This kind of more goes really far on the other side of focusing on dramatic elements and story and narrative. And then once we get further down his filmography to something like a Baby Driver, there's more of like an equilibrium to the two. Like, he has like the entertainment value certainly in Baby Driver, and he has the comedy in Baby Driver, but he also has the story structure and the focus on narrative and character development. And so
I would say Baby Driver feels very on par tonally with Hot Fuzz, minus some comedy. It's not quite as slapstick, but feels like it has a very similar like balance of those elements.
If Hot Fuzz was Edgar Wright's first attempt to be more traditional, Baby Driver was just his second better attempt at it. Because he goes from Shaun of the Dead, he tries something else. Scott Pilgrim, he goes more back to feeling more like Shaun of the Dead, I would say. And then with Baby Driver, he's like, okay, I'll try it again. So
yeah,
it feels like he was like, okay, let's try being a normal person for once. So
yeah. And I think that's one of the things that makes Baby Driver work so well, is that while Because I think Baby Driver was I think that was the first Edgar Wright movie that I had seen. So my understanding of him as a director was I didn't have this kind of preconceived notion of what an Edgar Wright movie was. I didn't have that preconceived notion, and so then when I went back and kind of saw, oh no, this is who Edgar Wright is, it kind of, Baby Driver feels much more like a conventional film in terms of the story and the characters, but where you see the Edgar Wright is definitely with the editing, with the sound design, with the sound mixing, with how everything is synchronized together. That's really where you see the Edgar Wright's individual thumbprint on the film. Whereas the narrative and characters and all that feels like it could be more traditional.
Yeah.
But we can get into more of that when we do Baby Driver on the show, which I can't wait to do. That's going to be a great week. The excitement you're feeling for Scott Pilgrim week is the excitement I'm feeling for Baby Driver
Dude, just
week.
let me watch the movie.
1 week.
I could have watched it like a billion times before then now.
1 week.
Come on, man. I want to point out something that I've been doing a little research. So, Hot Fuzz has a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. Shaun of the Dead has 92%. And they also have the exact same IMDb score, so you are wrong, Connor.
What about the Metacritic?
I don't. Okay, I can check.
Tell me the letterbox.
Metacritic for Shaun of the Dead is 76, and
75 for Hot Fuzz.
Oh, it's 81.
Hey!
All right, they got 1 out of the 3. Cool, good job.
And I'm the person that's least involved with media criticism in this room. I've been on less shows than Matt, and I don't do it for a living.
Yeah.
But I agree with the critics here.
No.
Dude, Connor only listens to Metacritic from now on.
Yeah. My opinions have to be in line with Metacritic for the rest of my life.
If you want sponsorship, call them out.
Yeah.
So,
I'm Connor Murphy, and I endorse Metacritic's opinion of these two films.
So
You have to say that every time this show starts.
I'd love to spend some time pointing out specific elements or scenes that we liked about the movie, because we spent a lot of time talking about which of the two were better and not a lot of time praising Hot Fuzz.
All right. What do you like?
I kind of wanted... You were talking about how you instantly knew who Shaun was in Shaun of the Dead. I think it's also important to note how quickly they tell you who Nick Angel is in Hot Fuzz, with one of my favorite opening sequences of a movie. The everything from like his footsteps slapping on the floor as he comes towards you way too long from the police in the police office, and then he gets there and this crazy like ever-present like crazy EQ'd bassy like Sergeant Nicholas Angel, and then cut into that really fast
resume.
Yeah, resume basically. And then ending with him being stabbed by Santa. Like,
Played by Peter Jackson.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
That's very cool.
I think he says Saint Nicholas.
Yeah.
I think I remember. Dude, why did we have to destroy the English language?
True.
I think it was, what was it? It was oi from Shaun of the Dead when they said, I was like, I love that. Why can't we have that?
Yeah.
We don't have anything that we can say like that with that like amount of power and also say it on air.
You're right.
Going back to things like parts of the movie, like I love how there's not a ton throughout the movie. There's not a ton of like blood or gore, and then there are parts where there's just an absurd amount, and I love that. Like when the piece of the church broke and just crushed his head and everything, it was beautiful.
But dude, what about the reverse where the guy's jaw just gets slammed on top?
That was great as well. That was
irony.
Yeah,
ladies and gentlemen,
I love it. It was cool because it came out of nowhere, because there really wasn't that much blood or gore in the movie before that, and then that something of that magnitude happens.
Right.
It's great. It's jarring, and it has that effect. It's supposed to have that effect.
Yeah.
And I thought the work that they did, the prosthetics and the practical effects of it all, it looked excellent.
I think that my favorite joke in this movie, I don't know why, but it's always in my head, when Nick Angel gets to Sanford for the first time, and the chief of police says something like, the previous guy had one thing that you don't have. And then he's like, what's that? And it's like a dramatic moment for a second, and then he's like, a great big bushy beard. And I have that. That's always in my head.
I love the when they're in the pub for the first time and those kids have braces, and there's just this blinding glare from the braces.
Yeah. And the laughter, like childish laughter, starts getting louder, and it's stuff like that's like the Edgar Wright charm, definitely. And I feel like it's definitely not, Hot Fuzz is not without that at all. It's just slightly less than Shaun of the Dead.
I feel like watching Hot Fuzz directly after Shaun of the Dead probably exaggerates it more. I know, and I think one of the main reasons that I would prefer Shaun of the Dead is because I want to watch Hot Fuzz. It just feels kind of lacking. But when it happens, I'm like, oh, okay, there it is. Okay, yeah, cool. And then that'll keep me going for the next little bit until it happens again. But I know, I think I like, if I'm going to watch a movie casually, I like just more relaxed, more just sort of fun. And I think when Shaun of the Dead is on, that's why I would watch it.
I also have to say, I always compare Shaun of the Dead and Zombieland in my head, and I generally feel like I would go to Zombieland first, just because Hot Fuzz exists, and that's like my Edgar Wright movie. So if I need an Edgar Wright movie, I go to that. If I need Shaun of the Dead, I go to Zombieland. I don't know why. I don't think it's necessarily a better movie. It just holds a certain place in my heart.
Well, we did end up talking a little bit about Zombieland last week.
It actually took me a while to remember the name of it, but it was when we kind of diverged, just talking about zombie spoof films. And I was like, oh, there's that other one with Mark Zuckerberg in it.
Yeah.
Because I would just go right to that before I can remember Jesse Eisenberg. But yeah, I mean, it's good. I think we talked about it, but never actually had watching both of them at once.
Have you guys both seen Zombieland?
Yeah, I think
we watched it
last year. Yeah, we
did it
watched
back to back.
Shaun of the Dead and Zombieland. Like, I don't think it was exactly back to back, but they were right next to each other.
Yeah, we watched both
within like a day or two, I think.
Yeah,
but I like Zombieland. I think it's good. I think Shaun of the Dead is a far superior movie.
Yeah, well, Shaun of the Dead is much more of a spoof than Zombieland is.
Yeah,
or like indirect, direct. Depending on which way you look at it.
That's a good point. Zombieland is sort of a spoof, but it's not through and through spoof.
Yeah.
It definitely takes itself seriously,
whereas
whereas Shaun of the Dead doesn't.
Yeah, it's that self-awareness that really separates it too.
Right.
And it's that self-awareness that separates it from Hot Fuzz from Shaun of the Dead as well.
I think I would agree that Shaun of the Dead is a much better movie. I don't know, something about Zombieland. I think I've just known it for a while, and it's just become something that's dear to me.
So as we transition into final thoughts, Matt, what are your final thoughts on Hot Fuzz?
Dude, it's an Edgar Wright movie. I love it. It feels weird saying it's my fourth favorite Edgar Wright movie because fourth sounds like bad. Like, no, that's bottom. But I mean, it's Edgar Wright, my favorite director. So I mean, it's pretty good. And I think pretty much everything we covered pretty much encapsulates why I prefer Shaun of the Dead, but don't dislike this movie at all.
Yeah. Connor, final thoughts.
I think that Hot Fuzz is a really good movie. I think it hits all the marks for me. There's a word that Wagner had for true art, and it was used to describe like theatrical performances because it was like the music and the theater and everything. I think it's like Gesamtkunstwerk or something like that. And it's supposed to be like, it's like total work of art is what the word means. I feel like Hot Fuzz kind of does that for me. It's not the best example of that I've ever seen, but it hits a lot of the marks. It's comedy, it's action, it's drama.
Yeah. To me, I guess that's what Baby Driver is for me. I'll say I like Hot Fuzz. I like Shaun of the Dead a lot more, and I like Baby Driver a lot more. I'll have to wait until after I see Scott Pilgrim again to know whether I like Scott Pilgrim or Hot Fuzz more.
You better.
But I like the movie. I think it does a lot of things really well. I obviously really like Simon Pegg and Nick Frost in these roles. I think they're great. I feel bad continuously comparing it to Shaun of the Dead because it's a film that should stand on its own and not just be in comparison to that movie. But with the nature of the show and this month, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, you kind of have to.
But I feel like, and especially when you're talking about a director who has a very distinct style, you have to compare when they do that style in one movie and when they do it differently in another film. And I just feel like a lot of the things that Edgar Wright does in Shaun of the Dead, he does better in Shaun of the Dead and doesn't do them as well in Hot Fuzz. I don't feel like it's as clever of a film. I don't feel like it's as witty. But, you know, it's still a good movie, and I think if I really got invested in the story, if that really did it for me, then I probably would have overlooked the fact that it doesn't do those things as well as Shaun of the Dead. But just for whatever reason, I don't get truly invested in the story. I think it's good, and I like it. It's just I'm not, like, enraptured in it. I'm not completely caught up on the edge of my seat trying to figure out what's going to happen next with this story. And so, as a result, some parts of it drag for me. But, yeah, I like the film, and I think it's good. So that's going to do it for our discussion of Hot Fuzz from 2007. The next film that we're talking about next week. Matt, would you like to say what movie we're talking about next week?
We're talking about Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
We are.
I'm so excited.
From 2010. That is the next film we're going to talk about as we continue our month of Edgar Wright movies. So be sure to check out next Saturday for Scott Pilgrim, because all episodes of Movie Night Tonight go up on Saturdays online. Once again, I am your host, Nathanael Molnár. I'd like to thank my panel for being here with me. Matt Smith, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
And Connor Murphy, thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
Make sure to like, comment, subscribe for more content, and be sure to follow us on all of our various social medias at Movie Night TNT. That's Movie Night TNT. There through our social media, you'll get our links to our YouTube, to our Spotify, to our iTunes, where new episodes of Movie Night Tonight drop every Saturday. So you'll be able to see our past episodes, all of our previous episodes up there, as well as future episodes, like when we do Scott Pilgrim versus the World. And until that discussion of Scott Pilgrim versus the World, thanks for listening.